Hi, today we are going to do a code review of an Oak Harbor web design website by the user Oak Harbor. Let's have a look how the website looks like. Now, the website shouldn't look like this, but it certainly does on my Firefox. Why does it do this? If we open up the inspector and reload the page, you can certainly see why. It labels these CloudFront images and CSS files and jQuery and whatnot as tracking. And this is because they are coming from another domain, and I have enabled the Enhanced Tracking Protection in my Firefox. Now, disabling this enhanced tracking shows the website as it should be looking, but this is cumbersome as I think many ad blockers will do this by default nowadays. And I can't remember if, but probably at some point Firefox will enable this by default. And if your clients see that kind of website, then you would be screwed. But fortunately, there is a quick way to fix this, because you shouldn't be serving these files directly from the CloudFront URL. Instead, you should be configuring, for example, some kind of subdomain like static.oakharborwebdesigns.com would point to this CloudFront DNS. That way you could serve both of the static website and the static content behind the same root domain, and it probably wouldn't be considered as tracking. But other than that, I must say that this is a really beautiful website. It has the Dartmouth Toggle, which is pretty new to me. I haven't seen one like this in a personal website. And let's see what happens if we press it. Boom. This is just beautiful. This is like mind-blowing beautiful. Fortunately, we're not doing a design review because there's not much I could say about this. We have shooting stars and everything. Very good job there. But let's have a look at the code. Now, I could nag about the missing readme.md file, but instead I will give you a good hint on how to create one. So this is my own project, which I usually use for my own other projects to create the readme. So you just run this script and it copies the readme template into your project. This is the default template, and then you just change the texts as you like, and it has a really good structure. It guides you through it, and then you have a really good readme. Easy as that. You should definitely try it. Okay, let's have a look at the JavaScript file. This file contains all the JavaScript for this project. First things first, var and let, both mixed up. Nowadays, you shouldn't be using var anymore. It probably does the wrong thing. In jQuery, well, you are using function scopes most of the time, but still you can shoot yourself in the leg by using var because it's quite unintuitive how it works, because it's function scoped, not block scoped. So just use let and const and you'll be on the safe side there. It probably works as you would expect it to work, especially if you're new to how JavaScript works. Another thing is that using let versus const. Now, this is personal preference, but I usually use const all the time, and then only where I cannot do it with const, then I go back to let. And that's because it prevents you from doing some bugs like shadowing variables. And if you can change your own convention to prevent these kind of bugs, then why wouldn't you do it? So I would advise to use const by default and then let only if you have a need for it. I also noticed that you are using both jQuery and the document.query selector. Nowadays you probably can just get away with document.query selector because the browser support is pretty good nowadays. And you can use something like sidebar li.classlist.add instead of the jQuery's add class. Another thing that pops into my eye directly from here is that you have a console log in your production code. Probably should be removed. It's good for debugging. Don't worry, you can use debugger or console log or alert or whatever, but just make sure that you remove them before you go to production. Now when we scroll down, okay, here, if you see some repetition here, now this is handling the dark mode that you saw earlier. And well, how I would do this is that I would just add and remove the dark mode class from and to body element, because then you can check if the body element has the dark mode or not. Doing this, you're basically repeating yourself a lot, and it's easy to miss when you're refactoring this and adding and removing new elements. You'll need to add them to the HTML and to the CSS and here. So in 3 places. If we removed this, then we would only have 2 places to add them. So less code to maintain, and you probably avoid some bugs. Let's have a look at the CSS file. So there's a bunch of CSS here. Most of it, I think it was in the course.css. Yeah, so as you can see, 1,732 lines. that's at least 1,000 too many. I probably would split this into smaller files, especially when you are doing stuff like you have one comment that says buttons. This would be a perfect point to split it into buttons.css. Then I see that you are doing polyfills in the CSS file. Now, I saw some commit messages which said that run polyfill generator or something like that. And well, it's a good thing that you do it with a machine, not by hand. But still, I think you could consider a build step for this code, because having these polyfills in your version controlled code, it just adds noise. I don't know what this means. It's probably just the polyfilled version of, let me see, this probably, or something like that. Gradient, yeah, probably from this. I would rather read this than this in my code, because if you have the same thing 4 times, which is basically all of this can be derived from this one, then it's easy to make mistakes and forget to update one of these because you have committed that, and it's not an automatic step. And another thing that speaks towards having some kind of build phase for your code is if we have a look at the source code, you can see that it has a lot of white space. Well, it compresses pretty well, of course, but this shouldn't be human readable anymore, since it's meant to be read by the machine that is rendering your file. So we could just ditch all the white space and do some minification here. One thing I would suggest would be to use parcel, because it just works out of the box and it does stuff like this. It probably concatenates your CSS files and whatnot, and compresses your images and CSS files and JavaScript files and whatnot. So you could just slap it in, and I think you were using Netlify. So you just slap it in, do the configuration file, and Netlify automatically builds it before it publishes it when you push to Git, and Netlify notices it. So why not to do it? It should be really straightforward to do it, and then you just get rid of all these things that come because you were avoiding the build step. Another thing in this CSS file is that I see that you are using lots of important. The important is something that I think that 99.9% of the times you shouldn't be using at all, because it's just a really good way to shoot yourself in the leg in the long run. Because once you go important, then you can't go important, and not if, but when you need to change this or some of the other importance or override that, then you're in trouble because you have lost your case already. So I would suggest that check out how the CSS Selector Specificity thing goes. So each class or ID or tag name you add to the selector basically makes it a bit more important without using the important flag. So you can use that to override your CSS where you want it. And that's my suggestion. Always use the plain CSS selectors to make hierarchy in your CSS, and never use the important. Now I said 99.9% because there are some really edge cases where you can use important, in my opinion. If you have a third-party library that you can't affect in any way, and it's doing inline styles and injecting like a chat box in your website or something, and you really want to alter how that chat box looks like, then you basically have no other way of doing it than using important if you want to do it in CSS. But even then, just be very conscious about what you're doing. Right. And then, well, this minus 700 pixels, but it seems to me like you're moving stuff around. Consider using the display grid for that nowadays, because then you can actually reorder your template areas instead of doing absolute positioning. I think this is all I have for you at this time. If you have any comments, and especially if you disagree with me on any of these cases, please leave a comment, because I love to be wrong and I love to learn new things. And if you would like me to review your project, please let me know. And if you like this video, please subscribe, and thank you for watching, and happy coding!